Jean-Jacques Rousseau famously said, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Steven Erikson wrote a book based on that theme and included a whole bunch of poop jokes and a ferret. The God Is Not Willing is a 2021 book from Steven Erikson. It is the first book in what Erikson is calling the Tales of Witness, which is another spin-off series from the main Malazan Book of the Fallen. And this year, the new book is about, what is the new book called? The second book in this series, No Life Forsaken, is coming out this October, so I picked this up to reread it. I'll be doing a spoiler-free section here at the beginning, and then spoilers at the end, because I want to talk about some themes that I really have to get into the details to really get into it, you know? So I think the story of how we came to the Tale of Witness series is very interesting. Erikson has been open with the fact that he was working on the Carcanis trilogy, which I have back there. I've not yet read. I'm waiting for the third one to be announced so I can be fresh when I read them. But as I just mentioned, he was through 2 books, and that second book, the sales, according to Tor, were not quite where everyone wanted them to be. Erikson was happy with the series, but also understood that maybe there was another place he could go with his writing to attract new readership or to get people, buying and reading again. And I think that's interesting because Carcanis is, as far as I've heard, again, I've not read it, a very philosophical work. Now, all Malazan books are pretty philosophical, but apparently those books really go far in like the deep introspective. It's focused on the Tistandi, who are very long-suffering people, very thoughtful people. And so it's sort of a slow, philosophical, very strong thematic work. And I think it's interesting with the Tales of Witness, I think Erikson was like, all right, I've gone to one extreme in this series. I want to kind of shift a little bit my writing style the other way, because Malazan is self-reflective and philosophical and slow, and the vibe and the style of the Books of Witness are much different. This is a shorter book. It's less than 500 pages. It is an incredibly linear story. There's a relative small cast of characters that you can really understand who they are pretty quickly, and very digestible. And yet, Erikson is not going to sacrifice strong themes or some of his comedy or some of his willingness to go to hard places in narrative for really great payouts. So it's really, really great in that aspect. And actually, what I would recommend to people, if you're watching this and you read some of the first Malazan books and have been having trouble connecting to them, or for some reason it just didn't work for you, I shouldn't say main, but like the Malazan Book of the Fallen, the sort of series that most people read first, I actually would recommend picking up The God Is Not Willing. There are some things that you might not completely grasp, but I think it would slide off you just fine. And it is a much more linear story, which I think is what most people struggle with in the Book of the Fallen. And you can see very quickly the rewards of sticking with Erikson, and maybe that will give you some encouragement to go back to the main series where there's that payoff and even more because there's more content, more characters, etc. Especially if you're a Malazan veteran, let me know in the comments, do you think people can read this without reading the main 10? I know there's some characters they're not going to realize the full backstory or anything along those lines, but I think you could still grasp the main part of this, and in fact, most of it, and it's a very different experience than the Malazan Book of the Fallen 10 big books. All right, so what is this great book actually about? This all takes place in northern Genabacchus, where Gardens of the Moon takes place, the beginning of House of Chains, same continent where Memories of Ice takes place, and Toll of the Hounds. This is in the very northern reaches of Genabacchus, a very extreme climate. Last we saw it was in House of Chains, because that is very famously where Karsa Orlong comes from. And much of this work is about the past wrongs, not just of Karsa Orlong, but a lot of people in the tale, and how that has affected this whole area. And as the Karsa story includes, how this area, despite it being illegal in the Malazan Empire, has continued in the slave trade. And a lot of the bad generational trauma that happens because of that, along with, of course, all the terrible things that Karsa Orlong has done, and civilization in general. There's a lot of really strong themes there for this area. One particular thing that is happening, and we find out in the prologue, so this is not a spoiler at all, but there is a ancient hold of ice, or like this big iceberg that is melting to the point where pretty soon it is going to collapse and flood this whole region. And the northern tribes, including the Teblor and the Jek and a couple other magical races and peoples, have found out about this and don't really know exactly what to do, but they have to leave their homelands and they are now forced to flee. And so they have unified into this big army that is looking to go south because that's their only option. Now, the Malazan Empire has noticed that these tribes and peoples have been unifying, but they don't know about this impending natural disaster. So they think they have to prepare for potentially an invasion. And so they send the 14th Legion to this northern area, specifically to, I think it's Silver Lake. Is it Silver Lake? Yes. Silver Lake, which is like the farthest northern reaches on Ganabakis of the Malazan Empire. I think I said earlier in the introduction, but this takes place 10 years after the final book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, The Crippled God. So this whole book is this growing tension between the northern tribes coming south and the Malazan army that we know coming north. And in the midst of that, probably our main character, if I was going to pick one, is Karsa Orlong's half-son, bastard son, Rant, who grew up in Silver Lake, even though it's a human settlement, and has a rather tragic backstory, but is slowly realizing his power and his kind of innate goodness in the midst of this very hard struggle. And he's going to play a pretty big part in the book as a whole. Great, great character. This book is excellent. All of the themes are strong. The characters are great. It is probably the funniest pound for pound Malazan book. I laughed out loud a lot in this book. I mean, the Marines are really funny. Rant, sort of in an innocent way, is very funny, especially with some friends that he meets. So funny, so good. And like I said, it is a very focused story. So if that's something you've struggled with in Malazan books in the past, please check out The God Is Not Willing by Steven Erikson. I'll have much more to say in the spoiler section. But for now, let me say very clearly that The God Is Not Willing is absolutely an all-time great, best of all time on my series. And in fact, even within like the Malazan world, these books that I already love and are my favorite fantasy series, this is going to be towards like the upper third of books. Sorry for the noises from the upstairs. Apparently they're moving chairs up there. All right, the spoiler warning, hopefully you just saw, which means now we can talk about spoilers. I first want to say I love how Erikson deals with lore in this book. There's no like sit down with a council that tells of all the ways that the Malazan Empire has changed, but we learn of things through Spindle's perspective, who by the way, Spindle is quickly becoming one of my favorite bridge burners between this Orb Scepter Throne that I just read and obviously what he's already done in the main Malazan Book of the Fallen. We also have that brief interaction with Monkrat, which is the closest we get to a scene that is just like, this is how the world has changed. But even that is sort of obscure. I just think it's so fun. Like the runs, like the new system of magic, how different magics and elder magics are changing and breaking down, how the Malazan Empire itself is changing. And in fact, a lot of the like epigraphs at the beginning of chapters are from historians about what's called the late Malazan Empire. So you kind of get the idea that this is not as powerful a empire and army as we saw at the beginning of Gardens of the Moon under Kellanved, or I guess that was, not Kellanved, but that was after. You know what I mean? Things are changing, but Malgrel is, I am spoiling. Okay, Malgrel is still emperor. So obviously he has sort of had a strong foundation of power that has lasted much longer than his predecessor. I'm already getting too in the weeds here. The way that the beginning of House of Chains is reflected in this work is so great. I love Damask that is in there, Widow Dalis, Sarlis, like all of these characters that are brief hints in other books, even like the half sisters of Rant. I'm forgetting their names at the moment, but the other daughters of Karsa Orlong that we saw in Toll the Hounds, like all of these characters are so well done. But at the same time, I don't think, as I said in my other review, that you have to have a clear memory of all of these things or you're not going to understand The God Is Not Willing. Like these things are not fan service. Erikson is using them in the story to connect you to it, but like you don't have to know that, and it's still really powerful. All of these characters, all of these things that happen are really, really great. I also want to say a quick shout out that this might be, this is a big thing to say, probably not true. This is recently, this might be my favorite group of Marines. They are all so funny. Stillwater and Onyx Fro, Banger, all of these characters are hilarious. And because there's not as many, and you're really just focusing on the Marines in Silver Lake. They're not really doing a whole lot. You really get close with a lot of these folks. Even Captain Gruff, who doesn't have as much screen time, is like instantly recognizable as a character. And then of course, Spindle, I'm learning now sort of in the post Book of the Fallen world, is kind of becoming the fiddler, where he is like the connector for the audience of all of these things that are happening and the weight of the past. It's just also great. This is such a funny book. I want to talk really briefly about 4 themes that I find incredibly powerful in this work, which again is under 500 pages. So the fact that there's this much to chew on is really, really impressive. First, I want to talk about how this book shows the sort of order of importance to geopolitics versus disasters or natural disasters. And it's something that we deal in our real world all the time, where there are these geopolitical issues of nations and states and alliances and what this country wants out of that country and what our relationship to either of those countries might be if we do certain things. And I think this book shows that, sure, of course that stuff is important, but there are times where it is simply as, well, simple as people need saving, or there are refugees who need help, or human life is being taken unnecessarily and you have the means to help. You should. Because the geopolitics of this area and the history is very clear that the northern tribes, the Jek, the Teblor, should be fighting each other. And they overcome that to unify. And then it should be that they want to fight the Malazan Empire and the Southerners and the children, as the Teblor call them, because they've been enslaving these peoples and forcing them out of their land. So like in a weird way, it would be just for them to attack and sort of conquer the Southern, just as the Southerners conquered the North. But that quickly becomes unimportant once this natural disaster of this great flood happens. Many, I think at least 3 scenes where like there's going to be a battle that is going to cause loss of life, death, destruction, like really terrible things. And then suddenly, in light of a flood that is coming, completely stops, and all the people who are about to kill each other are on the same side trying to save people. And it's really, really powerful, especially in today's world, where that is happening all over the world, where refugees are being created by war, by famine, by climate change. And there is going to constantly be questions on, especially in societies where voting matters, whether it is most important to think of the most geopolitical advantageous thing for your country to do versus what I would say like the morally right thing to do in preserving life, and how those 2 things interact and how one is so much more important than the other. I think this is really, really well done, especially to a world that needs this message. Secondly, rage and anger over, like justifiable rage and anger, is really a strong theme in this work. Most like concretely in the blood oil, and especially with Sarlis. She is dealing with the anger that was like forced upon her by her rapist, Karsa Orlong. An incredibly difficult, hard thing, and that rage like bubbles in her and forces her to, she's a victim to it and what she has to do. And eventually that's why she, casts Rant out, because she doesn't want him to be a victim of that rage. And one of my favorite scenes in this whole book is when Benger, Stillwater, and Annex Fro come, and they can't heal the rage, but they can direct it to a better conclusion, away from Sarlis and hopefully into good things. And great cameo of Anamander Rake as a dragon for sure, and that he has to wander endlessly running from his enemies, because if he comes into existence, they know him and they try to find him, so he has to exist in non-existence. Very, very interesting. And he has that great line where someone says, this is to save a life. I think it's Benger, like, why should I do this? To save a life. And he says, no other reason is needed. Again, all these themes are obviously interwoven. And it's interesting going back and rewatching my review from when I first read God Is Not Willing. I took the Sarlis scene as a commentary on addiction, which I think is true. But the second time around, I think it can be used for addiction. And the second time around, I was much more focused on the anger and rage part of it, especially because it connects with Rant at the end. One of the reasons that Warbitch is able to stem the tide of the coming flood is because Rant gives her like the power of his rage, basically, that is able to give her the power necessary to stop this for just a few small moments. And I think that is like this beautiful picture of what anger can do when directed at the right things, at injustice or wrong, and that it can be completely debilitating and destructive when it is not focused in the right spots. And so I just think it's a very fascinating, layered theme that is put in a lot of different places in this work. Also intimately connected with the next theme, which is this constant tension, and this is really in all of Erikson's writings, between redemption, forgiveness, and compassion, and how that works its way through existence, especially when people constantly hurt each other and do terrible things while also have the capacity to do incredible, wonderful things. And of course, I think that the tip of the spear in this work is Damask, who, from how we know him in House of Chains, was a villain. He helps enslave these northern tribes and the Teblor. He leads people into the mountains, into these territories they shouldn't be led into, and he was active in the capture of Karsa Orlong, several others, as a slaver. One of the worst villains of history. But in this work, it is his kindness towards Rant that really gives Rant the space to want to live and to start to heal from the trauma that he has experienced. It's truly wonderful, and also it's not because of that one act of compassion, all that Damask has done is not forgiven. In fact, he dies a pretty terrible death, and in many ways he feels like that is a just death from the Teblor being nailed to the rock. There's just always this interweaving of, again, compassion, redemption, having to be earned, forgiveness. In all of these different stories, they're interwoven quite well, and this is obviously something that is very close to Erikson's heart and never gives easy answers. Finally, I mentioned the Rousseau quote at the beginning just for fun of I think it's the beginning of his Social Contract, that man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. And the idea that Rousseau talks about is that our societies build these expectations around us that control us in many ways, even though we are free to do what we would like. For the most part, that freedom isn't real in the actual experience of our lives. And Erikson does this beautifully. First and foremost, this is called Tale of Witness. It's a callback to Karsa Orlong. So many of our characters are born or have experienced trauma, and those are chains of a sort that force them to do certain things. Force in a loose term. The ever-connected nature of our choices, the history we're involved in, and the choices that we make. There's actually one really beautiful, kind of tragic internal monologue about freedom with, I'm forgetting his name, it begins with a V. Valak. His name is Valak. Valak is an ex-slave who's filled with this fury, but also doesn't really want to just throw his life away for revenge against the slavers at Silver Lake, and so he doesn't want to attack the Malazan Marines, and it's sort of a quirk of history that he actually gets his foot caught in a bear trap before the charge, so he doesn't die in the ensuing struggle with the Marines. But he has this whole internal monologue about he was a slave and now he has freedom, but it feels like the freedom that he has and his ex-slaves have, all they are able to do is be caught in the cycle of violence and wanting to go and get revenge, even though he doesn't really want to do that. The same thing is true of Damask. Same is true with Rant. Rant is intimately tied to the trauma that created him and the rape of his mother, but also he has had evil perpetrated upon himself, which forces sort of this innocence upon him, this faux innocence that stunts him, and there's so many interconnected parts. And again, all this is connected largely to Karsa Orlong and the wreckage that he has created. But then going back to that theme of sort of redemption and forgiveness and compassion, Karsa reaches a point where he's now obviously a god, but he is not owning those things that he did previously, and he has changed quite a bit. But that doesn't change the fact of what did happen. It's a very deep point. And also, the whole point of this novel, that this large ice storm is coming, it's just referenced a little bit at the end. And I didn't even recognize it the first time I came through. But the whole reason that this flood is going to come and destroy so many lives is because so many hundreds of thousands of years ago, the Amas were so bent on destroying the Jagat that they were trying, that is what created this Omtos Philak pocket that made this ice that held back the waters, that allowed this inhabited realm to be inhabited when the Amas tried to, because of revenge, destroy all of the Jagat that created this situation hundreds of thousands of years later. So even this current big catastrophe happens because of the interconnectedness of both rage, anger, and evil perpetuated first by the Jagat and then by the Yamas. It's just like, it's very, very layered and thick and really, really well done. I love The God Is Not Willing. I cannot wait for No Life Forsaken, which is coming out soon. Before the end here, I'm going to plug two things. One is just generally, because I'm such a fan of Steven Erikson, please pre-order No Life Forsaken. If you're a fan, I don't know if you know this, but in publishing, pre-order books sales are like one of the major measurements of success, and we got to make sure Erikson and everyone knows that we love these books, so pre-order it if you've watched till now. Secondly, I'm going to drop a complete summary of the book, a sort of longer summary, sometime in September, leading up to the release of this book. And if you don't want to reread this whole book, that'll be really, really helpful, so keep an eye on that. Like, subscribe, let me know in the comments what you think of The God Is Not Willing by Steven Erikson. First in, last out.